SABC News correspondent Blake Sifton joins us live from Tel Aviv in Israel with the latest update on how these news have been received there. So Blake, a very good afternoon. How have the news been received by the Israeli leadership at this stage? What is their current reaction on the ground? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. We've heard reaction from Israel's foreign ministry just in the last half hour. They have said that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Foreign Minister Gideon Saar decided, following South Africa's false attacks against Israel in the international arena and the unilateral baseless step taken against the Chargé d'Affaires of Israel in South Africa, that South Africa's senior diplomatic representative, Minister Sean Edward Bindveld, is persona non grata and must leave Israel within 72 hours. They also said that additional steps will be considered in due course. Now, this diplomatic representative is not South Africa's ambassador to Israel. That's because South Africa recalled their ambassador to Israel in November 2023 over Israel's conduct in the war in Gaza. This diplomatic representative who's being made persona non grata by Israel is actually South Africa's representative to the state of Palestine. But because, of course, Israel controls the borders of the West Bank and controls visas, they do have the power, the ability to expel foreign diplomatic representatives to.
Let's now take you to a story we broke a bit earlier of the Department of International Relations and Cooperation informing the government of the State of Israel of its decision to declare Deputy Ambassador Ariel Seidman of the Israeli Embassy in South Africa as persona non grata. I actually want to read from the statement that we received a bit earlier on, indicating that they're actually giving Mr. Seidman 72 hours to vacate South Africa. I believe our reporter Kylie Kumalo is ready for us, standing by in Pretoria with DIRCO spokesperson Crispin Piri, just to unpack a bit more what exactly all of this means. Good afternoon, Kylie. Most certainly a pleasure talking to you yet again. It has been the biggest story since the past hour, and just the statement not really sharing a lot of information around the series of violations that we now want to hear of. So it's over to you with Crispin Piri.
Well, certainly, Mfundo, we continue with our rolling coverage. So where we're coming to live from now is just outside the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, a very key department for South Africa in terms of its foreign.
To unpack the movement's response to DIRCO's decision to expel Israel's Chargé d'Affaires from the South African embassy, a move that has drawn significant local and international attention. We are now joined by Ali Gomape. He's the spokesperson for Africa for Palestine and joins us now via our video link. Mr. Gomape, thank you so much for your time this evening here in SABC News. I mean, let's start off here. What is your reaction in terms of Pretoria's stance following the expulsion of Israel's Chargé d'Affaires?
Mbali and viewers at home, and thank you for having us. Africa of Palestine welcomes this particular move. It's well overdue. We think it's good riddance. Africa of Palestine has been calling for the closing of the Israeli embassy to begin with, for the expulsion of all diplomatic staff and diplomatic personnel of Israel from this country. This, of course, Africa of Palestine is not saying it out of their pockets. It's a decision by the ANC conference of 2014. It's a decision by the parliament. South African parliament took a decision on this particular issue. The last administration of parliament before the new one. So Africa Palestine we were quite pleased that the fellow has been kicked out of South Africa. But we want more. We want more to be done. We want the South African government to fulfill its commitment and severe and to cut all ties with the apartheid state of Israel.
The row between Israel and South Africa has just escalated. Both countries have expelled the highest diplomatic envoy from the other in a tit-for-tat move. It started with South Africa issuing this statement, giving the Israeli Chargé d'Affaires in Pretoria 72 hours to leave the country. Ariel Seidman was declared persona non grata. South Africa accused the Israeli embassy of misusing its official social media handles to insult President Cyril Ramaphosa and breaching the Vienna Convention by not notifying Pretoria about visits from high-level Israeli delegations. The accusations refer to two incidents. Last November, the Israeli embassy put up a social media post which mocked Ramaphosa by saying he had a rare moment of wisdom and diplomatic clarity South Africa also condemned the visit of an Israeli delegation to the Eastern Cape province in January because Pretoria says it was not informed that a senior Israeli diplomat was part of the group. South Africa says that Israel's actions represent a gross abuse of diplomatic privilege. In response to Pretoria's actions, Israel put out its own statement. It took a dig at South Africa's actions against Israel in the international arena and declared the South African diplomatic representative persona non grata as well. Sean Edward Bynevelt was also given 72 hours to leave Israel, but Pretoria has hit back by saying that Bynevelt was ambassador to the state of Palestine, not Israel. Israel's jibe about actions in the international arena almost certainly refers to South Africa's case at the International Court.
South Africa's decision to expel Israel's diplomatic envoy marked one of the most severe ruptures in relations between the two countries since the end of apartheid, signaling a sharp escalation in Pretoria's long-standing criticism of Israeli policy toward Palestinians. The move did not emerge suddenly, but rather followed months of mounting diplomatic friction, parliamentary pressure, and South Africa's increasingly vocal positioning within global forums on the Gaza conflict and international law. Israel's immediate response, rejecting South Africa's stance and warning of consequences, transformed what had been a moral and legal dispute into a full diplomatic confrontation with international implications. South Africa has historically framed its foreign policy through the lens of anti-colonial struggle, human rights advocacy, and multilateral legal processes. Since 1994, successive governments have drawn parallels between apartheid-era South Africa and the Palestinian experience, a comparison that has shaped Pretoria's relations with Israel for decades. While diplomatic ties were normalized in the post-apartheid period, relations remained uneasy, punctuated by recurring condemnations of Israeli military actions in Gaza and the West Bank. The latest rupture followed renewed violence in Gaza, which South African officials described as a humanitarian catastrophe and a violation of international law. Statements from the presidency, the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, and Parliament repeatedly emphasized civilian casualties, the blockade of Gaza, and the role of international actors in enabling or failing to restrain Israeli military operations. These positions were reinforced by South Africa's formal legal actions at international institutions, including moves at the International Court of Justice, which elevated Pretoria from vocal critic to active legal challenger. Domestic political pressure played a decisive role. South Africa's ruling African National Congress has long supported Palestinian self-determination, but in recent years opposition parties, civil society groups, trade unions, and student movements intensified demands for concrete action rather than rhetorical condemnation. Protests outside Israeli-linked institutions, calls for sanctions, and parliamentary motions urging diplomatic downgrades created a political environment in which symbolic measures were no longer considered sufficient. The expulsion of the Israeli envoy represented the strongest diplomatic tool short of severing relations entirely. By declaring the envoy persona non grata, South Africa signaled that it viewed Israel's conduct as incompatible with normal diplomatic engagement. Officials framed the decision as consistent with international law and moral responsibility, insisting it was not an attack on the Israeli people but a response to state policy. Israel's reaction was swift and uncompromising. Israeli officials rejected South Africa's accusations, accused Pretoria of political bias, and dismissed the apartheid comparison as inflammatory and historically inaccurate. Israel emphasized its right to self-defense and accused South Africa of aligning with hostile actors rather than serving as an honest broker. Diplomatic channels were further strained as Israel signaled it would reassess bilateral cooperation and engagement. The confrontation reverberated beyond bilateral relations. Western governments watched closely, aware that South Africa is not a marginal actor, but a leading voice in the global South, a member of BRICS, and an influential participant in multilateral institutions. Pretoria's actions risk deepening existing fractures between Western powers and emerging economies over the Gaza conflict, international law, and the legitimacy of global governance structures. For the United States and several European countries, South Africa's stance complicated diplomatic balancing acts. While Western governments maintain strong strategic ties with Israel, they also engage South Africa as a regional power and economic partner. Pretoria's decision challenged Western narratives and exposed divisions over accountability, enforcement of international law, and the credibility of human rights commitments. Within Africa, reactions were mixed but significant. Several governments expressed solidarity with South Africa's position, viewing it as a continuation of Africa's historical opposition to occupation and colonial domination. Others remained cautious, wary of jeopardizing relations with Israel or Western allies. Nevertheless, South Africa's move reinforced its image as a continent-level agenda setter rather than a passive participant in global diplomacy. Economically, the immediate impact appeared limited, as trade volumes between South Africa and Israel are relatively modest compared to Pretoria's ties with the United States, the European Union, and China. However, the symbolic consequences were substantial. Diplomatic expulsions send signals to investors, international institutions, and allied governments, potentially influencing perceptions of political risk and foreign policy alignment. Israel's warning of retaliation raised questions about the durability of remaining diplomatic links. Potential responses ranged from reciprocal diplomatic measures to lobbying allies to pressure South Africa economically or politically. While no immediate sanctions followed, the standoff highlighted the increasingly politicized nature of diplomacy in an era where moral positioning, legal action, and strategic alliances intersect. The dispute also intersected with South Africa's broader foreign policy trajectory. As a founding member of BRICS, Pretoria has increasingly emphasized South-South cooperation, multipolarity, and resistance to Western dominance in global institutions. Its actions against Israel aligned with a wider pattern of challenging established power hierarchies and advocating for reforms in international governance. Critics within South Africa warned of potential diplomatic isolation and economic repercussions, arguing that symbolic actions could undermine pragmatic national interests. Supporters countered that moral leadership carries costs but also enhances global credibility, particularly among nations and movements advocating decolonization, justice, and legal accountability. Israel's pushback underscored the limits of moral diplomacy in a geopolitically fragmented world. While Pretoria framed its actions as principled, Israel and its allies viewed them as selective, politically motivated, and dismissive of Israeli security concerns. This clash of narratives highlighted deeper disagreements over whose interpretation of international law carries weight and who has the authority to enforce it. Media coverage amplified the confrontation, framing it as a diplomatic war rather than a policy disagreement. Headlines emphasizing expulsion, retaliation, and rupture reinforced perceptions of escalation, even as official channels remained open for limited engagement. The optics of confrontation mattered as much as the substance, shaping public opinion domestically and internationally. The episode also raised questions about the future of diplomatic norms. Expelling envoys has traditionally been reserved for espionage, direct interference, or severe bilateral crises. South Africa's use of the measure in response to humanitarian and legal concerns reflected a shift toward values-based diplomacy, where moral judgments increasingly justify extraordinary actions. For Israel, the incident reinforced concerns about growing isolation in parts of the global South. While Israel maintained strong alliances with major Western powers, diplomatic setbacks in Africa, Latin America, and Asia signal a changing global landscape in which narratives of colonialism, occupation, and human rights resonate more strongly. For South Africa, the decision reinforced its self-image as a moral actor on the world stage, willing to incur diplomatic costs to uphold principles rooted in its own history. Whether this stance translates into tangible influence or long-term strategic gains remains uncertain. As the standoff unfolded, attention turned to multilateral arenas. South Africa's legal actions and diplomatic moves placed additional pressure on international institutions to respond to allegations of violations of international humanitarian law. Israel and its allies continued to challenge the legitimacy and impartiality of these processes, deepening global polarization. The expulsion did not resolve the Gaza conflict, nor did it compel immediate policy changes. Its significance lay in the signal it sent, that middle powers in the global South are increasingly willing to confront established allies of the West through legal and diplomatic means rather than rhetoric alone. The long-term consequences of the South Africa-Israel confrontation remain unfolding. Diplomatic relations may stabilize at a lower level, deteriorate further, or eventually reset through quiet negotiations. What is clear is that the episode reflects broader transformations in global politics, where moral authority, historical memory, and legal frameworks are deployed as strategic tools alongside economic and military power. In this sense, the dispute transcends bilateral relations. It illustrates how the Gaza conflict has become a catalyst for global realignments, testing alliances, exposing contradictions in international law enforcement, and empowering actors outside traditional power centers to shape global discourse. South Africa's expulsion of Israel's envoy and Israel's forceful response marked not just a diplomatic clash, but a moment in the ongoing struggle over who defines justice, accountability, and legitimacy in the international system. The outcome will depend less on immediate retaliation than on how global institutions, allied governments, and public opinion respond to a world increasingly divided over values, power, and the meaning of international law.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.